Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to talk about automatic watches. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about with automatic watches is actually what is an automatic watch. An automatic watch is a mechanical watch that automatically winds itself as you wear it. It has a rotary system that automatically winds the mainspring, and while you're wearing it, it will wind the watch a certain amount of times or percentage during the day, depending on how active you are. To cover automatic watches before we go any further, I do want to cover one thing. Watches did not always start out to be automatic. Mechanical watches, they themselves initially were winding watches, and you had to wind them once a day. Typically, a mainspring on a watch would run for would power the watch for approximately 28 to 36 hours, depending on the watch, the size of the spring, what kind of a watch it was, if it was a pocket watch, a wrist watch. You'll see a lot of vintage ladies' watches out there. All of them are also just mechanical watches. So let's talk about those first. I'm going to put these aside. We're going to take a look at this watch here. This watch here is a Walton watch, and if we look at the back of it, you'll see that it is mechanical, obviously, and in its mechanics, it's a manual wind watch. So for instance, if we wind the mainspring, and I'm not sure if this watch works really well, but I haven't gotten to it. It's part of one of my collections. It's part of my collection of watches that I have to get through. So this watch, as you wind the mainspring by turning the crown when it's in the zero position, it winds the spring enough, and you can see, and I'll put a little mark here on it. We'll put a little mark on the ratchet wheel here, right there, so you can see. And as I wind the watch, you can see that the ratchet turns, and every time it turns, it gets to a point where the watch seizes up or the mainspring gets fully wound and you can't wind it anymore. Now, at this point, if I try to wind it any harder, I make the possibility of damaging the watch. I could either destroy the mainspring by cracking it, depending on the age of the mainspring, or I could possibly ruin a gear or a winding gear, a setting gear, or something inside that could get damaged if I wind too hard. Also damage the stem or clutch. And on older watches that have not been taken care of, what I typically find is that you'll run into maybe some water damage that's on the stem. If you try to wind it too hard, the stem will break. So you got to be careful with a mechanical winding watch, and that's just something to keep in mind. So if we look at this was typically before the 1940s or late 40s, early 50s, when automatic watches started becoming into manufacturing. We had just the manual wind mechanical watch. Again, you'd wind it once a day, and the mainspring would run it for anywhere between 28 and 36 hours. In some cases, you had some watches that would run 48 hours, maybe a little bit more, but those were rare. You'll see on like older cars from the turn of the 1900s, where you had 8-day clocks and the mainsprings were obviously big and long, and they could run the watch for approximately 8 days. So that's an example of a manual wind mechanical watch. So these were typical of the watches produced anywhere, especially wristwatches, produced anywhere from the 1920s up until the early 40s, late 40s, when we started seeing the first round of automatic watches. So that's a manual wind mechanical watch. Then we run into the automatic watches. Automatic watches started making their presence, mostly becoming popular in the mid-50s, and you'll see a lot of those with the like Omega watches started becoming automatic winds. You'll see bumper watches where the rotor only goes about 2/3 back and forth, and there's a little spring bouncer in there that the rotor would bounce on so that it wasn't annoying to you as you wore it. And other rotary watches that turned 180 degrees or 360 degrees, so they would wind as you wore the watch continuously. Now, this is an example of a Valjoux 7750. This is my own watch. I made this watch for myself, and I love this particular style. It's got a nice blue bezel, dark hands, beautiful case. This watch I wear probably 4 days a week, and is an example of a mechanical winding watch or an automatic watch, we have a rotor system on this particular watch that only works in one direction. So you'll say to yourself, well, I have an automatic watch, I throw it on my winder, it doesn't work. Well, this is partly why sometimes you run into these issues or situations where a mechanical automatic watch does not wind itself. So for instance, I'm just going to grab a screwdriver here. As this watch turns, in this case, if I turn the rotary system and I turn it counterclockwise, it's not winding the watch. There's no pressure or tension on the gears. It only winds in one direction. If I turn it clockwise, it now begins to wind the mainspring. So if I just give it a push, you'll see there's much more tension when I try to turn it clockwise than when I try to turn it counterclockwise, and it's a spin because there's no friction. There's nothing there to help wind the watch when it's turning counterclockwise. So this particular watch, the Valjoux, and a lot of ETA movements like the 2824 series, the 3000 series, the 4000 series, these watches do not wind in both directions. You will find on occasion some of them will. So the SW series watches, again, have the same situation because they're copies of the ETA movements. And again, those watches only wind in one direction. So you have to be conscious of that. So an automatic watch has this rotary system, and this whole upper piece here winds the mainspring. So there's a continuous series of gears and actuators in here. And as this watch turns, or as the rotary turns, this weight winds the clock, but only in one direction. Okay, so that can be frustrating to people. So I'm going to explain the difference as we get to the next watch, which will be a Rolex. And I believe this one is a 3135. Let's just take a look. I'm going to open this watch up. And this particular watch, the Rolex watch, a lot of the newer Rolexes, anything made after the 1970s, you'll see wind in both directions. And to test this out, what I'm going to do is, it's hard to see here, but I'm going to point to a certain part of this particular watch. This is the mainspring barrel right here. And when we're looking at the mainspring barrel, we're also looking at this gear here, which is the ratchet for the mainspring winder. And that connects to the arbor on the mainspring barrel. And when this turns, this brass gear right here, when that turns, it winds the watch. This particular model watch, and a lot of Rolex watches, a lot of the newer Omega watches, the Tag Heuer that are self-manufactured and not ETA movements, you'll see that those watches typically wind in both directions. So as this watch turns, if I flip the rotor that way or this way, either way, it's winding the mainspring. So that's an advantage of an automatic watch that winds in both directions. Now, you won't see that a lot on the ETA movements, but you'll see it on some of the Seiko movements, especially the older Seiko movements, the NH series, 35s, 36s that are still in production. You'll see that they wind in both directions depending on which model you have. This particular watch, again, as we turn the rotary system, this function automatically winds the watch whether this rotor weight turns in either direction. That's an advantage because it's winding twice as often as the Valjoux 7750 in this case. So as we wear the watch, and you can see if I turn the watch, whatever direction I turn the watch, that weight is what's winding the mainspring. Now, as these watches turn, especially the newer watches, one full revolution is not going to give you much of a wind. Sometimes when you pull a watch out of your drawer and it's been sitting there for a while and it's a mechanical automatic watch, it hasn't run for a while, you're going to have to turn the crown and wind the watch initially. You might only have to turn that crown maybe 5 or 10 times to get it to start, depends on the watch model. A very clean watch, you'd start on the second or third full rotation of the crown as you wind that mainspring. For every rotation of the crown that you turn to wind the mainspring, you're getting about 60 to 70 rotations of the rotor to wind the watch, sometimes even more. So one full rotation of the crown winding the mainspring on this particular watch may be equivalent to this rotor turning itself 360 degrees 250 times. That's how little automatic watches tend to wind the mainspring. So it may take a period of you wearing this watch of maybe 5 or 6 days to get to a full wind. It's never going to be enough just to turn the crown once, wear the watch for a few hours, take it off, and expect that watch to last 24 hours. It's just not going to happen. So one thing you need to understand is the articulated gears that are in the winding system, the automatic system, as you turn this rotor 360 degrees, these may only be turning 1 or 2 degrees, and that's not enough to give the watch enough power to run for a number of hours. So keep that in mind. On this particular model Rolex, because it winds in both directions, depending on how you wear this, if the watch rotor does this back and forth, it's winding the watch movement. It's not giving it a great amount of wind, but it is winding the watch. So when you put a watch on an automatic winder, a mechanical battery operated or AC operated winder, you have to keep in mind the direction of that winder's output. So for instance, some automatic winders will turn a watch, let's say they turn it in a clockwise direction. Now on this particular watch, because it's a Rolex, it's always going to be winding the watch in that direction or even in the opposite direction. So if the winder oscillates back and forth, maybe it works 1 hour in one direction, then stops, rotates the other direction for an hour, goes back and forth. Watch winders will typically wind a Rolex without an issue because they wind in both directions. However, if we take into consideration, like I said before, this watch does not wind in counterclockwise. So if the watch is turning, let's say this way in the watch winder, you can see it's never going to wind the watch because the rotor system, if you look, I'm turning the watch clockwise, but the rotor is turning counterclockwise. And again, in this particular case, for this particular model watch, it does not wind if the rotor is turning in the counterclockwise direction. So if you have this on your automatic winder and it never powers the watch, you might want to check the direction of your winder, something that a lot of people seem to forget about. Again, if it oscillates back and forth, and let's say it works 1 hour in clockwise and 1 hour counterclockwise, you're only getting half the wind because in this particular model watch, it'll only work in one direction. So you have to keep that in the back of your mind as you place your watch in the watch winder. Automatic watches or automatically wound watches are good for active people. But let's say you get a little older and you're a little more stagnant. I have some customers that are in their late 70s, early 80s. They have automatic mechanical watches. They tend to sit around and not do much during the day. And their complaint might be when they come in for service is that that particular watch is just not holding a charge or is not holding a wind. So it may only run for 4, 5, 6 hours after they've worn it for a couple of days. Well, if that's the case, then I'll typically try to qualify them by saying, how active are you? Do you go out and do things? You play golf? Are you putting around the yard? You wearing your watch? In that case, because the rotor would be going back and forth, it'll be winding the watch. However, if you're sitting around watching TV all day, you're not going to get any wind on your watch. It's just not going to happen. So you're going to have to manually wind it once in a while just to get it started. So it's something to keep in mind when you are purchasing or working on a watch. Now, on this particular model here, the rotary system works in conjunction with these two red gears. So a lot of watches are either 1, 2, or 3 gears for their automatic winding. For instance, as this rotor turns, okay, you can see those red discs and they're operating in opposite direction if you look closely, okay? I'll try to zoom in on that. Let's try to do it over here. I'm going to turn the rotor and keep your eyes on those red gears. Okay, you can see that they're turning. Okay, and no matter what I do or which direction I go in, they're both turning. Now, this particular model watch has these red discs or red gears are ratcheted, so they wind the watch continuously in one direction, even though they turn in opposite directions depending on the rotation of the weighted rotor. This being the weighted rotor, this being the rotor system, and then the mainspring and ratchet right there. Again, we can see that better here. We have the mainspring ratchet here. This is the ratcheting winding gear. This is the crown drive gear. And then we have our mainspring barrel, which is underneath this, okay? So as I turn the crown, it turns the ratchet, which winds the watch. Now on the ETA movements, on this particular ETA movement, we have, if you look closely, we have this plate here, which is made up of 2 gears. There's a gear under the plate here and one over here that continuously connect to this winding gear. And as this watch rotates, and again, it only winds in one direction. So if I turn it that way, it's not going to wind. If I turn it this way, it is going to wind. As I turn this gear, the ratcheting system will integrate into the mainspring ratchet and then fully wind the watch over a period of maybe 3 or 4 days. So something that you need to remember, how all of these work. Pretty much all mechanical watches that are automatics work very similar. Mechanical watches or manual wind watches almost always work the same way, where you have the drive gear hooked up to your setting and winding gears under this particular plate, and then you have a ratchet drive which drives the rotation of the mainspring inside the barrel. Mechanical watches, and if you look at older mechanical watches pre-World War II, you'll see that they pretty much all look like this, depending on their size. Again, this is what, 11 ling, I think, on this particular watch, and you'll see this particular type of mechanical movement anywhere from like a 6 ling ladies watch to as big as a 16 or 18 size pocket watch. They all pretty much all work the same on manual winding. Where we run into differences is in the rotor system. Again, with the Rolex watches, these work to wind the watch either way the direction of the rated rotor turns. On most ETA, they only turn in one direction. And you'll see on Seiko watches, again, they work in both directions. I'd say the most popular model right now is the NH35 model, which I see a lot being sold. And those particular models, because they're inexpensive, they have the great feature of winding in both directions. Something to keep in mind. Again, when we look at our winding system, or if you have an automatic winder, you just got to be aware of which direction your watch winds in. And if you're not sure, make sure that the winder oscillates in either direction and let it run continuously. Try not to let it run for a period of 2, 4, or 6 hours and then automatically shut off. You'll be very surprised when your watch isn't working. So let's take a look at the winder. The winding, the automatic winder that I have on this particular model, this turns in both directions. It'll turn in one direction, it'll turn the opposite direction, it'll run for a specific period of time, and that's all handled by the back switches. So if we take a look at these back switches, you can see, let me just turn them over here. So let's take a look at the winder. The winding, the automatic winder that I have on this particular model, this turns in both directions. It'll turn in one direction, it'll turn the opposite direction, it'll run for a specific period of time, and that's all handled by the back switches. So if we take a look at these back switches, you can see I've got this set to turn it in one direction, and if I wanted to turn in both directions, I'm going to turn the knob over to there. Now this is a slightly more expensive model winder, okay? This knob here will determine how long or short of a period of time that I want the winder to work. So for instance, if I set this over to 4, I can put a watch in here. I'm going to do that now. I'm going to put the camera down. So here I've got my watch in the winder. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach around. I'm going to turn the winder on. And I'm going to let it go in both directions. So what you can see now is that on this particular winder right now, it's turning clockwise. And my rotor system is turning counterclockwise, which means this particular model watch is not winding. It's going to work like this for a little while, and then eventually it'll shut itself off in this direction, pause for a few minutes, and then turn in the opposite direction. It's the way I have it set up. And I also have this set up to run as long as possible so that I get the maximum amount of wind. Now, if I knew the direction of my watch, and I'm going to turn this off for a quick second here. You can see now I've turned the knob to the opposite direction. So if I know that my watch is going to wind but the clock winding counterclockwise, which means the rotor is turning clockwise inside because it's always weighted on the bottom, my watch is getting wound. You have to understand in which direction your watch winds if you're going to use an automatic winder. If you knew which direction that your watch wound, but you weren't sure how to set your winder, you could run it for an hour in one direction, see if the watch winds. If it doesn't, then rotate it, turn the knob to set it to rotate in the opposite direction so that you get a full wind on your watch overnight. This helps to wind your watch automatically if you are so inclined to use it. I do recommend winders if you have an automatic watch, and the reason for that is that they tend to allow the watch to run continuously, so that if you throw it in a drawer for a couple of weeks or a couple of months and you come back, you might have issues where the watch might have a little hard time starting up because the oil inside is either set or dried up. It's always better to have a mechanical, anything mechanical, running continuously to keep it lubed and well running. So that's the explanation I have and the differences between the automatic watches and the manual wind watches and how automatic watches work and some of the differences in them. I hope this helps you guys. And if you're ever wondering how automatic watches work, go take a look at some of my videos where I break down the rotary system and explain to you in detail on how they all ratchet back and forth. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, guys.